everyone. It's nice to see you all for this week's research series. As some of you heard, I'll be sort of introducing Ian and moderating today as Scott is getting his second vaccine, so that's exciting. Okay. Ian is a postdoc over at University of Michigan at the Ross School of Business and the School for, we decided, Energy and Natural Resources at University of Michigan, a place that I hold very dear to my heart myself. I spent a lot of time there when I was a graduate student. Anyway, and we are looking forward to your talk and presentation on called Alarmed but Unmoved, the impact of the provision of correct local environmental information. So Ian will give his talk presentation. I will moderate once he is done. I'll handle questions in queue. I tend to have a harder time seeing when the hand button goes up, so if you could just say I have a question in the chat, that would be great. And then I can also keep the order correct. Okay. I guess, yeah, Ian, you wanna take it away?
All right, sure. Let me pull up my slide. All right. All right, so can everyone see my slide? All right, great. So good morning, everyone. I am Ian. So I'm currently a postdoc fellow at the University of Michigan. So I graduated from IU, the O'Neill School last year. So I was previously an Ostrom fellow, and I got a research grant last year, which covered a part of this academic year when I was still at IU. So it's great to come back and to, well, virtually, but it's good to see so many familiar faces. So today I'm presenting a paper from my dissertation, which was also partly funded by the grant that I received from the Ostrom workshop. So the title of the paper is Alarmed but Unmoved, the impact of the provision of correct local environmental information. All right. So policy and political knowledge is the foundation for attitudes and preferences. So despite the use of heuristics and shortcuts, an uninformed citizenry can have very different policy positions from an informed one. So the calling for a well-informed citizenry has been an unwavering message from researchers and politicians. So echoing this normative calling to inform citizens is the increasing popularity of mandatory information disclosure programs. So these programs require public or private institutions to disclose factual information about their products, service, operations, or performance to the public. So for example, school districts are required to deliver performance information to residents. Water utilities are mandated to issue consumer confidence reports, and candidates and the party committees are obliged to disclose campaign finance information. So these programs aim to use information to empower citizens to hold governments and the private entities accountable. So embodying the widely shared democratic values of transparency and participation, information disclosure has become one of the most ubiquitous and least controversial components of public policy. Well, the virtue of information disclosure programs obviously hinge on the assumption that citizens respond to disclosed information and use it for better choices. But the assumption is not always met. So while many studies have shown that information has led to changes in attitudes and preferences, others have found no such effect. And the informational effect can also vary significantly for people of different attributes. And so citizens may fail to connect information with specific policy positions, and the people may also engage in confirmation bias and motivated reasoning, which lead to a biased interpretation of information. So in this study, I evaluate the assumption by examining citizens' response to the provision of correct local environmental information. So there are a few contributions of this study. So first, I used a survey experiment design. Many previous studies on this topic are observational, but knowledge, preferences, and behaviors are often mutually affecting each other. So the experimental research design allows me to causally assess the impact of information. Second, this study examines the impact of information provision based on the direction and the size of the informational shock. While most existing studies haven't considered the nature of the information provided. So instead of treating information provision as a uniform treatment, so considering the informational shock, that is how the new information compares to their prior knowledge, will clarify how individuals respond to different information. So third, the information used in this study is personalized at zip code level. And in contrast, many other studies use national level information. And lastly, so most extent studies use general information on politics, such as information on the income inequality in this country, or like the share of the immigrants in this country. But this study uses information from an authentic information disclosure program in the environmental area. So where information tools are heavily and increasingly being used to inform citizens and deal with thorny environmental challenges. So let's get into the information used in this study. So the information used in this study is from the toxics release inventory, which is a major environmental information disclosure program in the US. It tracks the emissions of toxic chemicals from industrial facilities. So every year, more than 20,000 industrial facilities report how much of the toxic chemicals is released to the environment and managed through recycling, energy recovery, and treatment. To use the TRI data to better understand the risk from toxic emissions. So the Environmental Protection Agency has developed the risk screening environmental indicators, or it's also called like RISE score. So this model incorporates information from the TRI on the amounts of toxic chemicals are released, factors such as chemicals feed and transport through the environment, and each chemical's relative toxicity to calculate a variety of risk measures at different geographic levels. So I use the RISE score at the zip code levels, so which measures how the risk from toxic emissions for a certain zip code compares to other zip codes. So the figure here on the right shows the scores for zip codes in the contiguous US. I have a few things to say about this measure. First, the information used in this study is comparative. Specifically, the percentile ranking of respondents' zip code based on the RISE indicator described above. So I use the comparison format for a few reasons. First, the RISE score itself is from a screening level model and comparative in nature. So without more refined investigation, the score cannot be interpreted directly in health impacts such as mortality, life expectancy, or rates of various diseases. So with these limitations, the comparison format puts the RISE score in context and makes it concrete. Second, social comparison is also a powerful form of information. So people have the natural desire to be above the average, and social comparison information can facilitate the development of descriptive and injunctive norms. Lastly, so the comparative format is also commonly used in practice. So, for example, the comparison format used in this study is often how the TRI and reader information is being used in practice by the Environmental Protection Agency and the various stakeholders. For example, in EPA's comparison tools, when you enter your zip codes or your county information, they will show like how your county ranks in the country. So this is like, that's why we use this format in this study. So the survey experiment proceeds in 3 parts. In the first part, I connected the pre-treatment baseline information on the respondents, including their demographic information such as their income and gender, and also information about their political affiliation and their ideology and all the stuff like that. And most importantly, I assess their prior knowledge on the relevant issue. So I provided the background information about the RISA score to all respondents and asked them to answer the question: if we rank all zip codes in the contiguous US from the lowest risk to the highest risk from toxic chemicals, how do you think your zip code compared to other zip codes? Respondents answered the question on a scale, which is shown in the slide. So right after this question, I ask all respondents, how confident are you of your answer? The second step in the experiment involves providing the correct information based on the EPA data. So that is the actual ranking of their zip codes to the treatment group, but not to the control group. So only people in the treatment receive this information. And after the treatment, in the third part, I ask all respondents a battery of questions on their issue-specific environmental concerns, norms and attitudes, and preferences and behavioral intentions. So the survey was administered by YouGov on a sample of 1,000 adults in February 2020. So respondents were randomly assigned to either the treatment or control group with equal chance. So I have 500 in each group. So the sample roughly matches the national demographic profile of the 2018 American Community Survey. So the randomization is also very successful. So all the demographic and the pre-treatment measures between the treatment group and the control group are similar, and none of the differences are statistically significant. So I start by presenting some descriptive statistics to characterize respondents' initial knowledge or and the misperception of the risk in their community. So first, about in terms of the initial knowledge, that is their initial estimates of their community's risk compared to other communities. So respondents have ranked the environmental risk of their zip codes across the spectrum, ranging from the risk higher than 0% of the zip codes. That is, their neighborhood is the cleanest, and to higher than 100% of other zip codes is that their zip codes has the highest risk from toxic emissions. So on average, they estimate that the risk in their zip code is higher than 43% of other zip codes. So the initial estimates also show significant disparities across political and environmental attributes. So for example, on average, Democrats estimate that the risk of their communities to be higher than 48% of other zip codes. But Republicans estimates is at 38%. So Republicans generally think that their zip codes are cleaner than others compared with the thoughts of Democrats. And a gap of similar magnitudes exists between liberals and conservatives. respondents with a strong pro-environmental value, and also estimate their zip codes to have a higher relative risk. So compared with those that with weak pro-environmental values. However, there is not much difference between respondents that are confident in their knowledge or in their estimate and those that are not. So with both groups estimating their risk higher than about 44% of other zip codes. So in this part, we only considered their initial estimate that those people could be in different neighborhoods that have different risk. So the next part, we move to misperception, which is defined as the initial knowledge, that is their initial estimate, minus the actual ranking of their communities. So the results show that respondents are somewhat misinformed about the risks in their community. So 25% of the respondents have overestimated the risk in their community, while 74% of respondents have underestimated it. So of course, I don't expect people to know exactly rankings of the zip codes. So if I define the correct answer as within 15 percentage points above or below the actual percentile rankings, so 28% of the respondents hold the correct knowledge, or they're about right. And 20% of the respondents were about right if I define the correct answer as within 10 percentage points above or below the actual percentile rankings. So the misperception, however, also differs across subgroups. So while on average, all the subgroups underestimate the relative risk, the underestimation is more severe for Republicans than for Republicans, and more severe for conservatives than for liberals, and also more severe for people with a pro-environmental value compared with those with strong pro-environmental values, and also people that are more confident in their initial estimates also tend to have a larger like a downward estimation of the risk in their communities. So the next step, we move to the analysis on the effect of information. So because of the randomization, so the empirical model is straightforward. So I regress the outcome variables on the treatment. So the figure here presents the results. So each bar is from a separate regression for a different outcome variable, which is on the left. So all outcome variables are measured in 5-point Likert scale, and here I treat them as continuous. So the results show that the effects of the treatment on all outcome variables are largely like insignificant, except for concern for self and family, which is also only significant at 0.1 significance level. So one reason for the muted results may be that I haven't considered the direction or the size of provided information. So the direction and the size of information is important because information has to be new to have a large impact. If it only provides something that people already know, we will not expect the treatment to change their beliefs, attitudes, and their preferences. Similarly, the direction of the informational shock has strong implications for the direction of the informational effects. Since some respondents have overestimated risk, and we expect the treatment to have a negative effect on them, and some have underestimated risk, and we expect the treatment to have a positive effect on them. So the null results could be a consequence of the effects of the opposite direction offsetting each other. So especially as I have demonstrated, about 25% of respondents overestimate the risk, and about 75% that have underestimated the risk. So those two groups could cancel each other out. And in addition, a significant portion of the respondents, about 28%, process prior knowledge that is in the ballpark of the correct risk. And I don't expect the provided information to have a large effect on them as well, as it would offer nothing new. So in the next analysis, I'll consider the misperception. Again, misperception is defined as the difference between respondents' prior knowledge or prior estimates and the actual risk. So here I also call it informational shock. So the two are equivalent and used interchangeably in the presentation. So, and I estimate this model. So the model is basically evaluating the effect of provision of information at a different level of misperception. And it does that by comparing the outcome variables between respondents in the treatment group and the control group with the same level of misperception. So it's similar to the idea of creating a few beans based on the level of misperception and evaluate the treatment effect within each bean. So for example, we could have 3 beans. One includes respondents that underestimate the risk. One includes respondents that are about right, and one includes respondents that overestimate the risk. So because of the randomization, treatment and control status is also randomly assigned within each bean, so that I can identify the effect of information provision within each bean that is at different level of misperception. So the approach here can be considered that I have many small beans based on misperception, and that I plot the effects of information provision from these small beans that is at different levels of misperception. And the results here suggest that treatment effects do depend on misperceptions. For those that have underestimated the risk, the treatment increased the concern for self and the family, and vice versa for those that overestimate the risk. But the pattern does not apply to the concern for the country. Well, it makes sense because the provided information is at local level, at zip code level. So, and it doesn't say much about what's the overall situation in the country is. And we can have a look at the other variables. So again, the pattern of concern for self and the family also applies to the sense of personal obligation to act. But across the level of informational shock and the misperception, the treatment still has no significant effect on the attitude that the government should do more, and also on the 4 sets of measurement about on the preferences and the behavioral intentions. So besides the main analysis with the overall sample, I have conducted analysis for subsamples based on ideology and strength of prior knowledge. So the literature suggests that individuals will tend to accept or interpret information that is consistent with their existing preferences, and dismiss and be less receptive to information that contradict their existing view. So for ideology, we know that liberals and conservatives have different overall preferences on environmental issues. So the goal here is to say, if liberals and conservatives interpret information differently, and I conduct all the above analysis separately for liberals and the conservatives in my sample, and compare the effects on them. First, the figure on the left shows that the provision of information leads liberals to significantly increase their concern for self and family. In contrast, it has no significant effect on conservatives. But again, liberals and conservatives may experience very different informational shock or have very different misperceptions. So the figure on the right shows that when taking into consideration of informational shock, both liberals and the conservatives have the same pattern as the main analysis, but across the levels of misinformation, liberals tend to interpret information in ways that results in higher levels of concern for self and family compared with conservatives. And again, the impacts of the treatment on other outcome variables are mostly insignificant for both liberals and conservatives. across the range of the informational shock and or misperceptions. So the next subsample I have looked at is based on respondents' strengths of prior knowledge. So the literature suggests that for people with strong beliefs, so new information that contradicted their existing beliefs will cause cognitive dissonance, so which makes them less likely to accept the new information compared with people that with weak beliefs. So in the my survey, I asked respondents their confidence in their prior knowledge, and I divide them into two samples based on their answers. So those are confident of their answer and those are not confident. Again, I conduct analysis separately for the two samples and I compare the treatment effects between the two groups. So panel A shows that for respondents that are not confident in their prior knowledge, the treatments significantly increase their sense of personal obligation and their intention to participate in and contribute to relevant environmental groups, despite the fact that the effects on other outcome variables are not statistically significant. So for people that are confident in their prior knowledge, the information has had no statistically significant effect on all measurement of concern. So that's like they are less likely to change. So when considering the informational shock, the effect on concern for self and family is statistically significant for people that are not confident in their knowledge, and those that heavily underestimate the risk. So we also see that while information provision increased concern for those underestimate the risk, and the decreased concern for those overestimate the risk in both groups, across the range of informational shock, the effect is larger, either positive or negative, for respondents without confidence in their prior knowledge, which suggests that their beliefs is more malleable when the strength of the knowledge is weaker. So to sum up, in this study, I examine the effects of the provision of local environmental information on individuals' beliefs, attitudes, and preferences, and the behavioral intentions through a survey experiment. So the results suggest that people are misinformed about the relative risks of their communities, and the degree of the misperception depends on personal attributes. Despite the existence of misperception, individuals can correctly process information to update beliefs and attitudes, but the information doesn't further change preferences and behavioral intentions. So moreover, although the informational effect depends on personal attributes such as partisanship, ideology, environmental values, and the strength of prior knowledge, the provided information mostly has impact that are consistent with the direction and the size of the informational shock for all subgroups of different attributes. So these results undergird the potential of using information as a policy tool, but also highlight the challenge in designing such programs that can spur a meaningful and meaningful participatory and behavioral changes. I think that's my presentation.
Great, well done, Ian. That was super fascinating. I don't know about everybody else. I learned a whole lot. The queue is currently open for the moment. So feel free to, let me know if you have a question there. And let's see, Jamie, it looks like you have a question. Do you want to begin?
Sure, I'd love to. Yeah, Ian, your work is really fascinating. And I deal with knowledge like from the epistemology side of things, so the super theoretical, conceptual. So it's just really cool to see how you're looking at it from like the very practical nuts and bolts kind of perspective. So that's really cool. And your work prompted lots of good questions. So to me, that's always like lots of interesting questions. So thank you for just really triggering my curiosity. So I'm going to limit myself to one question, and I'd like to know more about like how you determined what's an endogenous variable versus an exogenous variable. Because when I think about those two things, I think about them as very ecologically oriented. Like, you know, they're determined by the context. So what's exogenous in one situation is not going to be in another. So yeah, how did you determine the difference between those, and what are some examples of each in your work?
Yeah, thank you. That's really a great question. So even though I have a like experiment design, but still there is like exogenous, because people hold different misperception tends to have different characteristics, right? So that's a really hard question, especially in the part that I compare the effects at different level of misperception, because some people that overestimate the risk could also be more likely to be Democrats, right? And then when I compare the effect, is it because they have a larger effect? Is it because of they are Democrats, or is it because informational shock is bigger for them? So that's really a hard question for me, and I feel like in my this research I can't really separate the two. But what I will be able to say is that first that the experimental design is that regardless of what I have a random assignment in the treatment control group. So in that part, that is the effect, the informational effect from the treatment effect is like a real, because regardless of their characteristics, because the effect is observed by comparing the same people in the treatment group compared with the same people with the same characteristic in the control group. So that part is good. But for the other thing I have to say is that the important thing is for me is to say that all the goals, the ultimate goals of those information disclosure program is to correct misinformation. And then I have really centered that piece of information in my analysis to say, because all the goals are to correct information, and then that's why I single out the level of misperception, and that's like the key thing I want to take away. So that's like the argument, and also compared with to say how I made advancement in the literature is that most of the existing studies, they don't even consider the direction of the information. They only consider the treatment. So this is like a step forward, but still, yeah, there are endogenous issues in like how they perceive those informations. But from a practical point of view, I would say that I have captured the key thing that the policy tries to change. That is the misperception. I hope it answers your question. It's like kind of rambling on.
Great. It looks like Tom has a question. I think you're next.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. Really interesting stuff. And I was thinking about your results, the very last slide, I think it was. I think you said that folks who were more confident in their knowledge were less likely to update their beliefs. I think that's what it was. And I was wondering, what if they're confident, but they're also wrong? Like if people find out that their perception was really wrong, yet they told you they were confident. I think in the real world, we have a lot of people who are very confident, yet also very wrong. Did you tease that apart and see if there's an effect on people, not just whether they're confident, but if they're confident and yet they're also wrong, which of those kind of is more powerful?
Yeah, so I think let me I haven't shared my slide up, but I could go back to say something there. I think so I have done two analysis, right? So by the strength of prior knowledge. The first one is just to say the effective treatment. That is, I didn't consider anything about their the misperception. I didn't consider the degree of correctness, and then I look at the effect. And but for the second part, let me just share this really quick. So for the second part, so here is the graph that shows that when I consider the direction of the misperception, so those are the degree along this line is that your degree of correctness, right? If you're closer to 0, then you're correct, but you're further away from it in either direction, you are more wrong. And then this dark line is for people that are not confident, that is their opinion are malleable, and those are confident people that are not malleable. So actually, I feel like it's very interesting. I don't know if it's by accident or what. You can see that when the people are most correct. So for most group that they don't have so they have no effect, the treatment, right? So when we are moving away from, let's say, so even when we are like, for those that underestimate risk, we say that the thing has an effect, even on those people that are confident, they change their opinion, but it's just very small, right? And it's not significant, but in this case, but I think it's like they are changing. So it's like they are not like they are resisting that information, but they're learning it very cautiously. That's like my interpretation of the results. I don't know if that answers your question, Tom.
Yeah, so it does sound like even though they're way wrong, they felt confident going in, so they're not changing as much, which to
Yeah.
me feels like what we're seeing in the real world. So yeah, thank you.
All right, great. I think Renzo, then Jamie, and then Brian.
Thank you, Jess. Ian, how are you? Good to see you. Hope you're doing well there. Well, congratulations first on the excellent work you're doing. I'm very happy to see your research materialize and evolve a lot. So great work with that. I actually have a question about the sample and generalization. I know, of course, there are issues with survey experiments with generalization, but you make a set of statements about to what groups your results can correspond. You talk about Democrats, Republicans, conservatives, liberals, but to what groups, demographic groups, or I don't think you can talk about geographic locations, but to what groups do you think beyond these others your results generalize? Or more specifically, do you think that the sample selection is biasing some of your results in some way? I know you've done a careful work on making sure that treatment and control are the same. But to what extent does this particular sample of 1,000 individuals can allow you to speak about a broader population, or to what broader population are you making these statements for? Thank you.
Yeah, okay, thank you, Renzo. I think, yeah, that's a great question. So actually, I personally haven't involved in a lot of the sampling process, thanks to the grant from the workshop that I got to dedicate to this, like a marketing research firm to do the job for me. So I think their approach is that, at least they claim, so, well, they have done a lot of work for people in political science, as well as in the general public opinion survey. So there are public, the YouGov is listed like a marketing research company. So they think they have a large group of a panel in their database. So what they basically do is that, I think it's a common practice among all the survey studies, is that, so they have this frame of a sample target, which is based on the American Community Survey, or some sort of like census, that is the whole population of the US. And then they use like a propensity score matching techniques to match on a few of the key metrics, and to select a sample from their panel, so that the selected sample will have the same characteristics as the American Community Survey, and based on those key metrics that I have selected. So technically speaking, it's a nationally representative sample, based on like how they construct it, right? So I think that this results would apply to, well, the US population in general, right? But there is some question about like how the validity of the approach that they constructed the sample.
If that's great, and if I may, if you could include something about that in the paper, or maybe a table with the characteristics of these 1,000 individuals, or some short or a couple of sentences explaining what you just said, I think would make it stronger to make sure that the sample actually, I know you say it in the first paragraph on that section where you talk about your sample, but maybe elaborating a little bit more would help.
Yeah, thank you, Renzo. That's a good idea.
Great, Jamie, and then Brian.
Yeah, my question actually, I didn't realize it's kind of related to Renzo's though, this idea about sampling, right? So, because I think the characteristics of the demographic would impact the results that you have. For instance, like you can label somebody a Republican, but if they are a farmer in upstate New York, they're going to have more knowledge about their local environment than say, a Democrat living in the city. I mean, and so, so I don't know if you have that kind of diversity in your sample. But if you don't, then that might be another step forward, right? It's to consider both people, urban dwellers and rural dwellers. Just by the nature of living, in the country, you tend to have, you're just closer to the land and closer to the environment. And so sometimes you're just going to have that knowledge just from living, from like where you live. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's a great point. So because that's also like a validity problem. So the internal validity is good in a way, but then that those results apply to people that are not participating in the survey, right? And the problem with any survey is that, well, people have to like be self-select in the study. And even for the YouGov, they claim that they had like 2 million respondents in their panel, but I assume that their sample will probably like lean certain direction. At least you need to have internet connection or something like that. But that's a great point. Thank you.
All right, Brian.
Okay, good. It's neat to see how you're trying to, figure out the impact of disclosure, and that it may be good, but it's not necessarily sufficient. So first, just the comment. It seems like for literature and concepts, stuff about the stock market and investors should have relevant ideas, including different kinds of investors and so on. In terms of application, and you talk at the end of the paper, which I skipped ahead and looked at, of wanting to try and figure out ways to do more. So it seems like an obvious area would be kind of environmental justice or environmental justice communities. How do you have people have a better understanding of the threats they're facing? So my question is, do you see ways or how would you go about applying this in environmental justice communities? And to push it a little more, do you have some ideas about how you could go beyond just this isolated individual kind of model and something that could capture effects of opinion leaders or leaders, influencers, what have you, something multi-level or network? Okay.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Brian. I think, yeah, the EJ thing is a great suggestion. So actually, well, a part of my dissertation deals with environmental justice stuff, but just didn't do it in this paper. Okay. So I think either way, I didn't do that. Is that for those is that I could because I have subsamples for Democrats, Republican, or all sorts of characteristics. I could also try to look at whether minorities or white would be respond to the information the same way or not. So that's like one way to do that. But the challenge with that idea is that so the sample is representative, but it somehow has like don't have many Black respondents. I think Black is like 13% of the population, so that 1,000 it's get like 80 or 70 something. Then it's like really hard to have a large enough sample to have significant or meaningful effects, especially with this this like experimental approach, because the variation is like it has to respond to the treatment. So that's the challenge here. But I have a correlational paper that don't try to tease out the causal effect. It's just to look at their using half of the sample. I look at their their perception of risk and the correlation with all the activities that or their opinions. So in that paper, actually I found some interesting result, but is that so I found that minorities tend to have higher levels of concern on the environmental issue. This is in their community, and also have like a higher intention to participate. And I also found that that kind of thing is mostly driven by, not by the traditional factors. So like a partisan affiliation or the liberal income is less, they have little impact for minority sample. What really important is like a idea called group consciousness. So it's like how much they feel like they are, the group themselves has been like disadvantaged in the society, and this disadvantage is unfair, and they believe that they could work together to make it good. So that's what explains a lot of the variation among minority groups to participate. But for the white group, it's like those things matter less. But what really matters is like a traditional factors, political ideology, and party affiliation, and all the other stuff that we are familiar with in explaining environmental attitudes and opinions. So yeah, I feel like I strayed away, but I got your point that it's very interesting piece to look at how minorities would respond to information, and this would also extend to like in other contexts, like how the actually change their behavior in some of the information disclosure programs.
Yeah,
but,
and some of that could be interesting for future work if you wanted to go in those kind of directions. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I totally get your point. Like, yeah.
Gustavo's next, and then the queue is open, but I have a question, so I'm gonna step in after Gustavo.
Hi, very interesting presentation and paper. I was thinking about potential biases on perceptions that they cancel out. So imagine the following thing: I underestimate the cost of war, but I also overestimate the cost of guns. Overall, I am right about when we should go to war, no? So what happened in these cases if you have something like this? So essentially, there are also costs and benefits associated with, let's say, environmental regulations or some trade-off that you lose or win stuff when you move in the policy trade-off. So if people have, biases, biases can, add up or cancel out. Again, I was thinking in that direction. If you can say something, or well, maybe not. I don't know.
Are you saying that so this information could have effect on their some of, let's say they have this misperception about the risk, so some of them could lead them to have a concern, but those people may not believe that their action will be useful or will help to address the problem, so that they don't move to the next step or something like that. So sorry.
So what I have in mind is then when you have to support or not, let's say an environmental policy, So I don't know, let's say clean energy. Maybe you underestimate the risk of environmental, dirty energies, but you are also overestimate the value of clean energies, and then overall you are right when you are essentially supporting or against a clean energy policy, So we cannot essentially discard those possibilities, no?
Yeah, that's right. So I think some of the analysis to speak to that, let's say, like Republicans are, well, I mean, I don't know if I'm correct. So let's say are more pro-development. That could explain why they are less responsive to the same information that I gave to them compared with the same information I give to Democrats, right? So that's like that could be, I group that into motivated reasoning, or it could be that they have different consideration. They just have different trade-off. That's a good point. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and then maybe not an issue in terms of the treatment, because these things could be balanced, or maybe you can argue that they are balanced. No, but I was trying to think about policy implications And that idea came to my mind. So again, maybe not such a big deal for the paper itself, but interesting for policy implication.
Yeah, thank you.
Wonderful. So my question is related to sort of broader implications and relationships to other work. So because a lot of these questions seem to hinge on like what is exactly your political psychology story here that would explain these differences. And because it makes me then think of folks like Liliana Mason, who has been doing a lot of work with a lot of other folks in the democracy space right now, right? And like thinking about specifically about like American polarization and whether polarization overlaps with sorting, right? And these kinds of questions. And a lot of her argument, it really boils down to the fact that, and my question is sort of whether this fits in motivated reasoning or not, that like people care so much about the team that they're on specifically, right? They've got either they see themselves as liberal or they see themselves as a Republican or however it is that they see themselves as a farmer, as whatever, that colors any information that they get, right? And so it's the facts themselves are kind of irrelevant, not because they don't provide a surprise component, right? And not because they already knew the truth, right? But because at the end of the day, people kind of care more about their team, right? And the sort of overarching group to which they belong, right? And so my two questions here, right? A, is that kind of part of the story that you're telling, or not? And B, more generally, would you expect these kinds of mechanisms to operate differently, sort of political psychology mechanisms to operate differently when it comes to localized environmental knowledge, as opposed to when it comes to national policy platforms of particular candidates, right? Like, is environmental knowledge in this context fundamentally different than like the kinds of work that people are looking at with respect to democracy and sorting and polarization, right? And relatedly, are the sort of political psychology mechanisms that might underlie the empirical results that you find more or less related to the sort of cheerleading expressive effect for your team, right? That then colors your interpretation of any quote unquote new information.
Yeah, thank you. I think, yeah, those are great questions. I'll start with the second one. So does the information matter? Like the type of information that I gave them matter, like in compared with other studies? I think it definitely matters. So when I was doing this study, I felt like my information is like not controversial, not political. It's about measurement of the risk in local communities. And when we speak of the information, like the local environmental quality, it's like not as a very partisan issue as other issues, right? Republicans also want the clean environment, especially in their own communities. But yeah, I just think that the effect of the definitely be very different when it comes to other information like immigration or.
But just a two finger on that, right? Republicans in this context, right, want a clean environment, but the sort of Democrats, right? But the difference is at what cost, right? Like what are they willing to give up? And it's the nature of the trade-off that differs across groups, not the extent to which they have those preferences or not, right? So that's where that's where the the hitch kind of is.
Yeah, I think that gets to the earlier question about like the trade-off of the benefit and cost trade-off of this policy as well. Yeah, that's good. So yeah, and as I said, many other I have actually cited quite a lot of different studies in my paper, and in many other areas that there's some study found there's a backfire effect, like you provide as part of the information to them, like they're even more defined of the information we're giving them. They are more like addendum in their earlier position. Like that's definitely an important consideration. That is my stuff only applied to the environmental area, and it's like a less controversial thing. And in public policy area, less political. And for the first question, I think again the team effect, I think that thing would be most salient if this is a strongly controversial partisan political issue, right? Because like they want to be on their team, and there I think for my study, there's a two things is that first, my information is at local level. So this is like a more like a pertinent to their own like a welfare or anything. That it's like it's about their own environment. It's not about other big issues about like immigration policy or like a foreign aid. That is like I mean, it's your tax dollar, but it's not like you can directly like have a link to the policy to yourself. So in those kind of things, I have to definitely say the partisan or political ideology would be much stronger compared with my case. But even in the relatively less controversial local environmental issues, we still see some difference like between them, right? And I think well, I don't know if I lost the question here. Like on some part you said about the implication of this about the learning, right? Or
yeah, well, I was more thinking about sort of the actual underlying political psychology of when this matters, right? Is it just about the group of people that you identify with, and that's what colors how you interpret this information?
Yeah, I think that's one that could be a potential reason, but I didn't investigate that in the study. But yeah, right, because I don't give them cue to like strengthen their partisan affiliation or something like that. But I take that as a given and to say conditional on some of your prior identities, and how would you like interpret the same information differently?
Okay, great. And I think we have, so Jamie has maybe the last question, which is, oh, Renzo, you had your hands up.
Yeah, let Renzo go first. I've asked two.
Okay, Renzo, go ahead. And then I think we'll have to wrap it up, please. I have to hop off at 1. So maybe if Scott or Angie could take over or Gustavo or something for that round, that would be great. But yeah, Renzo, go ahead.
Mine is just very brief, and I was wondering if Kahneman's work on bounded rationality is relevant to you. I don't see it cited in your paper, but it seems to me, based on how he develops this theory on prospect theory, cognitive illusions, how people make decisions based on the information that is accessible or not accessible when trying to decide upon something. So I think looking at that work might be relevant. Just an idea.
Thank you.
We do still have exactly 2 minutes left. So Jamie, if you wanted to do your follow-up, but then I'll hop off. I'm gonna have to hop off, but go ahead.
Okay, sure. And quick follow-up. So we also talked about like, you talked about the context, right? Like sort of this one people group, being more impacted by the informational shock. So, and others not so much. Did you find that sort of shock impacted like their preference for how to deal with that information? Like whether it was because you mentioned personal responsibility versus policy, and I found that really interesting. I didn't see, and maybe I just missed it, this correlation between like, how impacted you were by that information versus what steps you would take, whether you're working through policy or working through personal responsibility.
Yeah, I think that's, well, that's a very good point. So what I think this is actually creates a really, I haven't explored the differences, but I think it creates a really important issue. So there has been a lot of work on the economic side on like how people respond to this information by like moving away from the dirty plants or like by a bottle of drinking water or something like that. So that's like, so I just feel like this, the goal of this is to say how this could change policy, right? But if you are just adapting through your personal behaviors, I mean, it's good. I mean, some people got away from the harm, but the underlying problem hasn't been changed. And especially goes back to the environment justice problem. The people that have don't have the capacity to adapt are usually the poor and the powerless, right? And that's really a social equity issue. So I haven't explored much in that, but I think that it's a very important venue to move forward. I think the reason that they don't like have the government responsibility, there's two things that the information I give them are local, so they don't see this as a government problem. They just tend to do that through their own behavior, and also they think that it's more effective, right? Like if you want a government to do that, you have to overcome the collective action problem, and the policy may not change, but it's just either to, yeah, let's just move away, or like buy a air filter or something like that. But that's a really good point, that I think the result has to do with the information that I provide, and also like the calculation about like the impact of their effort in the public area, so that can make the change, and then that will be related to like have some implication for how the future policy could be, the information security policy could be designed with like a better features, like to say that can you just provide the information, or like the people can easily contact the EPA or something like that, to make them like a more people, just to like erase the barriers for people to act.
Okay, I know Angie or we can we can coordinate things, but if we have more questions or comments, please speak up, I think.